The village would later say the wind itself gasped when Thabo returned, because a man does not come home with laughter when his hands are dirty with betrayal. Nomsa stood behind the woven curtain and watched his vehicle crawl into the yard like a boastful snake, its dust still clinging to foreign roads. Beside him sat Cabello, relaxed and shining, occupying the seat that had once known Nomsa's quiet prayers. From the back climbed Moccabello and Sibasiso, stepping onto ancestral soil without greeting the spirits, and in that instant Nomsa felt the first crack of thunder before the storm. Their laughter spilled into the yard before their feet did, loud and careless, breaking the rhythm of a home that had always known restraint. Thabo walked ahead as though he were chief and owner, pointing at walls and doorways, as if giving a tour of cattle he had bred himself. Cabello's hand rested on Thabo's back with the ease of someone who had already measured the space for his own shadow. Nomsa remained still, because her father had taught her that the earth does not run when strangers arrive. It waits and remembers. Moccabello's eyes moved faster than her feet, counting beams, floors, and corners the way vultures count ribs on a carcass. She nodded to herself, as if pricing each memory, each pot, each carving left by hands long buried. Sibasiso followed with a leather satchel pressed close to his chest, its weight not of metal but of intention. The umsinsi tree outside rustled though there was no wind, and Nomsa knew the ancestors were already awake. Thabo poured drinks as though sealing a victory, his voice thick with confidence borrowed from ignorance. He spoke of journeys, of sunshine and freedom, of discovering his true self far from the watchful eyes of home. Cabello smiled and leaned into him, rehearsed and polished, while Moccabello took a seat once reserved for Nomsa's father without asking. No one noticed the missing cattle bells or the bare spaces on the walls, because greed is blind to absence until it is too late. Nomsa watched them move through her house as though through a market, touching what pleased them and ignoring what carried spirit. Cabello lifted a carved bowl, turning it in his hands, without knowing the prayer sealed into its grain. Moccabello ran her fingers along the wall, already imagining what could be sold and what discarded. Sibasiso opened his satchel slowly, revealing papers that shone white and sharp like teeth. He spoke gently, as men do when they intend harm but wish to call it order. He spoke of signatures, of efficiency, of endings that would be quick and clean if Nomsa would only cooperate. Thabo added his voice, warm and patronizing, telling her change was natural and resistance a waste of strength. Nomsa listened without lowering her eyes, because she had learned long ago that storms announce themselves loudly, but floods arrive in silence. What none of them knew was that, while they feasted beneath distant suns, Nomsa had been walking with ghosts. Each dawn she greeted the spirits of Bekizisa, her father, and the mothers who came before him, asking not for vengeance but for clarity. She traced the lines of land and memory with her feet, remembering what had been hers before vows ever tied her fate to Thabo's name. The ancestors answered not with anger, but with instruction carried on breath and bone. Count while they dance, the wind whispered through the grass. Untie while they sleep. So Nomsa counted cattle by moonlight and land by lineage, tracing ownership older than marriage and deeper than lies. She loosened knots that had been tied carelessly by hands that never read what they signed. Each day of Thabo's absence became a thread pulled quietly from a cloth he believed unbreakable. Now the strangers sat in her home like guests who had overstayed welcome they never received, certain the ground beneath them would not shift. Thabo finally turned to Nomsa, smiling as one smiles at something already claimed, calling her closer with false tenderness. Cabello straightened beside him, already imagining tomorrow as inheritance. The moment stretched thin and heavy, like the pause before the drum speaks truth. Nomsa did not speak yet, because wisdom knows the weight of timing. She looked once more toward the doorway where the umsinsi tree stood rooted and patient, its branches listening. The ancestors leaned in, the village unseen but present. And Nomsa felt no fear rise in her chest, The quiet woman had finished counting. And what comes after counting is never gentle. Nomsa stepped forward at last, not quickly and not slowly, but with the measured pace of one who knows the ground will not betray her. The room stilled, for even laughter learns to hush when certainty enters. She placed her father's old leather folder on the table, its surface worn smooth by decades of honest labor and careful thought. The sound it made when it touched the wood was soft, yet it landed heavier than any shout. Thabo began to speak again, filling the silence the way weak men do, explaining and softening and reshaping truth until it looked harmless. He called her by the name he used when he wanted obedience, his voice sweet like fruit, left too long in the sun. Cabello watched Nomsa closely now, sensing a change he could not yet name. Macabello's fingers stopped tapping, and Sibasiso paused mid-motion, his pen hovering like a bird unsure where to land. Nomsa opened the folder slowly, allowing the moment to stretch until impatience showed its teeth. Inside lay papers that did not glitter, but carried weight. The kind of weight that bends knees and empties pockets. She lifted one sheet and held it, where all could see. Her hands steady as river stone. The room leaned toward her without realizing it had done so. The homestead no longer answers to your name, Nomsa said, her voice calm and unraised. The words moved through the room like cold water poured onto hot skin. Thabo laughed once, sharply. The way a man laughs when he believes confusion will save him. Cabello frowned, Moccabello stiffened. And Sibasiso's pen dropped to the table with a small, betraying sound. Thabo spoke quickly, insisting on mistakes, on misunderstandings, on memories shared and vows made. He said the land was theirs together, that marriage had woven their names into one rope. Nomsa did not interrupt until he finished, because she had learned that letting a man exhaust his lies saves time. Then she placed another paper beside the first, aligning the edges with care. This land was given to me by my father, before your shadow ever crossed it, she said, her tone neither sharp nor soft. I entered marriage with it, and I leave marriage with it, though I have already released it to new hands. The color drained from Thabo's face as though someone had poured water from a clay pot. Cabello took a step back without realizing he had moved. Moccabello rose from her seat, her voice tightening as she demanded explanations and alternatives. She spoke of businesses, accounts, cattle in distant fields, and money that could still be reached. Nomsa listened, then laid out more papers like seeds placed carefully in a row. Each page carried a date, a stamp, a signature Thabo had once given without reading. The work you claim as yours has already been returned to the soil, Nomsa said. The company dissolved, the accounts emptied into paths you cannot follow. Sibasiso reached for the papers with shaking hands, reading and rereading, his breath shortening with each line. The crocodile had realized the river was deeper than it appeared. Thabo's voice rose now, losing its practiced warmth, accusing Nomsa of cruelty and spite. He spoke of love, of betrayal, of how she was destroying not only him but herself. Nomsa looked at him then, really looked, and felt no pleasure in his fear, only a quiet closing of a long chapter. I am not destroying, she said. I am returning things to their rightful owners. Cabello finally spoke, anger breaking through his polished calm, accusing Nomsa of acting out of jealousy and wounded pride. He said love could not be measured in papers and stamps. Nomsa turned to him with eyes steady and unafraid. And the room felt smaller. Love does not arrive with ledgers and witnesses, she replied. And it does not require theft to survive. Moccabello's mask fell completely then, her voice sharp and stripped of sweetness. She spoke of opportunity, of taking what could be taken before others did. She said the world belonged to those clever enough to seize it. Nomsa nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a lesson long understood. My father taught me the same thing, Nomsa said. But he also taught me that cleverness without respect invites the ancestors to collect payment. She slid forward one final document, thicker than the rest, its edges marked and worn. Thabo stared at it as recognition dawned too late. The agreement bore his signature from years before, written on a night when fear had loosened his pride. It spoke clearly of consequences, of ownership returning to its source when trust was broken again. Thabo's hands trembled as he read, the truth settling onto his shoulders like a yoke. Even Cabello could not deny the weight of it now. The room filled with a silence so dense it seemed to press against the walls. Sibisiso closed his satchel without a word, understanding that there would be no victory to carry home. Moccabello looked around once more, seeing not value but loss, and turned away. Thabo sank into a chair, smaller than Nomsa had ever seen him. You underestimated the quiet, Nomsa said, not unkindly. And you mistook forgiveness for forgetfulness. She gathered her father's folder back into her arms, holding it as one holds a child finally brought to safety. Outside, the umsinsi tree rustled again, as if in approval. Nomsa then spoke the words that ended the gathering, telling them to leave before nightfall claimed the yard. She did not threaten, for truth had already done that work. Thabo looked at her as if waiting for mercy to appear from habit alone. But mercy, like land, must be tended, not exploited. They rose and moved toward the door, no longer laughing, no longer certain. Cabello avoided Nomsa's eyes. Macabello's steps were quick and bitter, and Sibisiso's shoulders slumped beneath invisible weight. Thabo lingered last, searching her face for the woman he thought he knew. What he found instead was someone rooted and whole. When the door closed behind them, the house did not echo with loss. It breathed, slow and steady, like a body released from illness. Nomsa stood alone for a moment, listening to the quiet that followed truth. The ancestors had spoken, and justice had answered. Nomsa did not move immediately after the door closed, because endings, like beginnings, must be allowed to settle. The silence that filled the homestead was not hollow but full, layered with the breath of ancestors and the weight of truth finally spoken. She stood where she was, listening to the walls, as if they were elders clearing their throats after a long interruption. Outside, the umsinsi tree released a single leaf, and Nomsa took it as a sign that what had been heavy was now loosening. She walked slowly through the rooms, not counting what was gone, but acknowledging what remained. The spaces where furniture once stood felt lighter, as though relieved of false ownership. Her footsteps echoed differently now, softer, more honest. This house, even in transition, recognized her again. As evening approached, Nomsa lit a small fire in the hearth, not for warmth but for remembrance. She placed a cup of water beside it and whispered her father's name. Then the names of those before him. Smoke curled upward, carrying her gratitude rather than her anger. The ancestors, she believed, did not walk with those who clung to bitterness. Far from the homestead, Thabo sat in the passenger seat of the vehicle that carried him away, his body present but his spirit scattered. Cabello spoke in short bursts, trying to plan, to calculate, to repair a future that had collapsed before being built. Moccabello stared out the window, her mouth tight, already rewriting the story in her mind to paint herself as wronged. None of them spoke of Nomsa by name, because names have power when spoken with truth. Thabo's thoughts circled back again and again, not to the loss of land or money, but to the realization that he had never truly seen his wife. He remembered her quiet mornings, her long nights, her patience that now revealed itself as preparation rather than submission. The weight of his misjudgments pressed harder than poverty ever could. For the first time, he wondered how many warnings he had ignored because they arrived softly. Nomsa slept that night without dreams, the deep rest of someone who has stopped running. At dawn she woke before the birds and stepped outside barefoot, greeting the earth with her palms. She knew the homestead would soon belong to another family. and she felt no resentment toward that truth. Land, like wisdom, is borrowed for a time and then passed on. A message arrived from Zinhal later that morning, carried by glowing screen rather than drum or messenger. Her daughter's words were simple but steady, filled with pride rather than pity. Nomsa pressed the phone to her chest, feeling the circle close in a way that money never could. Whatever else had been lost, the future had not turned its back on her. By midday, Nomsa began the work of leaving properly, not as one chased out, but as one who chooses the road. She packed what carried spirits rather than value, wrapping heirlooms in cloth and care. Each item was thanked before being placed aside. She left behind what was meant to stay, trusting new hands to give it new stories. In another part of the town, Thabo made calls that went unanswered and promises that carried no weight. Doors closed politely but firmly, and voices that once praised him now spoke carefully. Reputation, he learned, travels faster than explanation. Cabello began to distance himself, realizing that love built on advantage dissolves when advantage disappears. Moccabello blamed fate, then Nomsa, then the ancestors themselves, never once turning the gaze inward. Sibisiso retreated into paperwork, hoping order could be restored with enough ink. But some losses are not errors to be corrected. They are lessons carved into time. The family that had come to claim a kingdom now argued over scraps. Nomsa visited her father's grave before leaving the region, kneeling where the earth still felt warm with memory. She spoke aloud this time, telling him she had finally understood his lessons fully. Strength, she said, was not loudness, and forgiveness was not surrender. The wind moved gently through the grass, and Nomsa rose knowing she had been heard. As she walked away from the homestead one last time, she did not look back, not because it no longer mattered, but because she trusted it to continue without her. The Umsinsi tree stood firm, roots deep, witness to many departures before hers. Reflecting on that, Nomsa smiled softly. Life, like land, endures beyond individual claims. Thabo would later tell people he had been ruined, that everything had been taken from him unfairly. Some would listen, others would not. But deep within, he knew the truth he avoided naming. He had not been robbed, he had been revealed. Nomsa's path led forward, uncertain but unburdened. She carried no illusions of ease, only the calm certainty of self-possession. The quiet woman had spoken, and the world had shifted just enough to notice. In that shift lived the promise of a life rebuilt, not on sacrifice alone, but on balance. Nomsa traveled eastward as the elders once did, not in haste but with purpose, carrying only what her hands and heart could manage. Each village she passed greeted her differently, yet the earth beneath her feet felt familiar everywhere, as though it recognized her intention. She slept where night found her, sometimes beneath roofs, sometimes beneath stars, and she listened more than she spoke. In listening, she began to hear herself again. At a riverside settlement, an old woman offered Nomsa food without asking her name, saying only that weary eyes deserved kindness. Nomsa ate slowly, savoring the warmth, and felt something loosen inside her chest. The old woman spoke of seasons that take and seasons that return, reminding Nomsa that loss is not always punishment. Sometimes it is a clearing. Word of Thabo's fall moved quietly but steadily, shaped by mouths that knew how to tell stories. Some said he had been cursed, others that he had angered the ancestors through arrogance. Thabo himself wandered from place to place seeking work, his confidence stripped away like bark from a tree. Each refusal taught him a new language, one made of humility he had never practiced. Cabello, sensing the shift of fortune, began to see Thabo less clearly as a partner and more as a burden. The affection that once came easily now demanded effort. And effort was something Cabello avoided, when it offered no reward. He spoke often of new opportunities elsewhere, his eyes already searching beyond the present. Love that feeds on comfort grows thin when hunger arrives. Nomsa reached a small town where she decided to rest longer, drawn by the sound of children learning beneath a fig tree. She watched from a distance as a teacher guided them patiently, her voice steady despite their restlessness. Something stirred in Nomsa then, a memory of her own daughter, and the quiet pride she felt in nurturing growth. She stayed, offering her help without expectation. Days turned into weeks, and Nomsa found herself teaching alongside the others, sharing knowledge shaped by experience rather than books alone. She taught the children to count not just numbers but consequences, to listen before speaking, to notice what is missing as carefully as what is present. The children listened, sensing truth in her calm authority. In teaching them, Nomsa discovered a new use for her voice. Meanwhile, Thabo's nights grew longer and heavier, filled with thoughts he could not silence. He replayed moments with Nomsa, seeing now the strength he had dismissed as passivity. Regret visited him often. Uninvited and unrelenting, he wondered if apology could still open a door. Though deep down he knew some doors closed to preserve what lies behind them. Moccabello continued to curse Nomsa's name, telling anyone who would listen that cunning had triumphed over decency. But her words carried less power each time they were spoken. Thinning like smoke without fire, Sibasiso returned to his work, careful and quiet. Avoiding risk as though it carried teeth, the family learned, too late, that overreaching leaves scars. Nomsa received another message from Zinhol, this one longer, filled with stories of studies, friendships, and hope. Mother and daughter spoke openly now, without the weight of unspoken compromise. Nomsa felt pride, not only in Zinhol's achievements, but in her clarity. The cycle, she realized, had shifted. One evening, as the sun fell low, the old woman from the riverside village appeared again, as if summoned by thought alone. She sat beside Nomsa and spoke of balance, of debts that are paid not in punishment but in understanding. She reminded Nomsa that justice does not always roar, sometimes it hums. Nomsa listened, knowing the words were not random. When the old woman left, Nomsa remained seated, watching the sky darken. She understood then that her journey was no longer about escape or defense. It was about planting again, differently, with wiser hands. The fear of loss had loosened its grip. Thabo would eventually hear of Nomsa's new life, of the respect she earned quietly among strangers. The knowledge stung, but it also taught him something he could not unlearn. Power, he saw now, was never borrowed. It was grown. He had mistaken proximity for ownership. Nomsa's days filled with purpose that did not exhaust her. She woke early, worked steadily, and rested without guilt. The ghosts that once walked beside her now lingered behind, satisfied. When she spoke of the past, it was without bitterness, as one recounts a lesson rather than a wound. The earth had shifted again, subtly but surely. Those who watched closely could see it in the way Nomsa stood, grounded yet open. The quiet woman had not only survived, she had transformed. And transformation, the elders say, is the most frightening justice of all. The rains came early that year, heavy and insistent, soaking the ground as though the sky itself was making amends. Nomsa welcomed them, knowing that water reveals what soil has been holding. The fig tree under which the children learned drank deeply, its leaves growing broad and generous. Life, it seemed, was leaning forward again. Nomsa's presence in the town had become familiar, woven into daily rhythms without announcements. She helped organize meals when harvests were thin and listened when words needed space to land. People trusted her, not because she demanded it, but because she never misused it. In time, the town began to see her not as a visitor, but as a pillar. One afternoon, a dispute arose between two families over a strip of land claimed by both. Voices sharpened, memories twisted, and old grudges resurfaced like stones after rain. The elders called for Nomsa, believing her calm might cool the heat. She arrived quietly, sat between the families, and asked each to speak without interruption. As they spoke, Nomsa listened not only to what was said, but to what trembled beneath it: fear of loss, pride of inheritance, and the need to be seen pressed against each word. When they finished, she did not rush to judgment. She waited until silence returned. Because truth often enters through quiet doors. She spoke then of rivers that change course, and of trees whose roots intertwine beneath the ground. She reminded them that land remembers all who walk upon it and belongs fully to none. Her words did not erase anger, but they reshaped it into something manageable. The families left without full agreement, yet with softened edges. News of Nomsa's way of resolving conflict spread beyond the town, carried by travelers and traders. Some came seeking advice, others simply to observe. Nomsa received them all with the same openness, careful not to place herself above anyone. Authority, she knew, collapses when it forgets humility. Far away, Thabo's journey continued unevenly, marked by brief work and long silences. He learned to survive without praise, to endure without applause. Each struggle stripped another layer of entitlement from him. Slowly, the man he had been loosened its hold. One evening, Thabo heard a story by a roadside fire, told by strangers who did not know his name. It was the story of a woman who had outwitted betrayal not with anger but with foresight. As the tale unfolded, Thabo recognized its bones and felt shame settle into his chest like a stone. Hearing the story told by others sealed its truth more firmly than Nomsa's words ever had. Cabello, sensing his influence fading, left Thabo behind and followed rumors of wealth elsewhere. He did not look back, convinced that attachment was the source of his misfortune. Yet wherever he went, instability followed him like a shadow. The ancestors, it seemed, were not done teaching. Nomsa's work grew heavier, but never overwhelming, as more people sought her counsel. She reminded herself often to rest, to remain a vessel rather than a reservoir. On certain evenings, she walked alone by the river, releasing the day into its current. Balance, she knew, must be practiced. Zinhul visited during a school break, mother and daughter embracing with laughter rather than relief. They walked together through the town, sharing stories without gaps or guardedness. Zinhul watched her mother with new eyes, seeing not sacrifice but strength. The inheritance Nomsa offered now was clarity. As the rains softened into steady rhythms, the town prepared for a seasonal gathering, calling neighboring villages together. Nomsa helped plan without directing, offering guidance while letting others lead. She understood that permanence is built collectively. No single voice, no matter how wise, should dominate the circle. On the night of the gathering, elders spoke of continuity, of remembering while moving forward. Nomsa was invited to speak, but she declined at first, believing the moment belonged to many. When she finally rose, it was only to thank the community for allowing her to grow among them. Her humility reflected back as respect. In the distance, Thabo stared at the same moon, feeling both its beauty and its indifference. He understood now that consequences are not always loud or immediate. Some arrive slowly, reshaping a life until recognition dawns. Whether he would change fully remained uncertain, but the lesson had been delivered. Nomsa returned home that night content, aware that her life had entered a different season. The wounds of the past no longer guided her steps, though they had shaped her path. Justice had not arrived as punishment, but as redirection. And redirection, when accepted, becomes renewal. The season turned quietly, as seasons often do, without asking permission from those who stand within them. The fig tree shed some of its leaves, making room for stronger growth, and Nomsa took this as a reminder that even good things must be released. She adjusted her work, stepping back where others could step forward. Leadership, she believed, was not about holding ground, but preparing it. One morning, a messenger arrived from a distant village, breathless and uncertain. He spoke of unrest, of accusations and threats that had begun to fracture the community. Elders there requested Nomsa's presence. Hoping her calm might steady what was breaking, Nomsa listened carefully, weighing the request against her own limits, then agreed to go. The journey was long and uneven, marked by rough paths and open skies. Along the way, Nomsa reflected on how often conflict begins not with malice, but with fear left unattended. She prepared herself not with noting words, but with stillness. She knew that what awaited her would require patience more than persuasion. When she arrived, the village greeted her with guarded respect, eyes measuring expectation against doubt. Two brothers stood at the center of the dispute, their voices sharp with resentment inherited rather than earned. Each claimed betrayal by the other, citing old promises and blurred boundaries. The air itself felt tense, as though listening. Nomsa asked them to walk with her to the edge of the fields where the land dipped toward a dry stream. She spoke little as they walked, letting the ground do some of the teaching. When they arrived, she asked them to describe what they saw. One spoke of drought and scarcity, the other of neglect and injustice. She listened, then told them a story of two birds fighting over a single branch, while the forest burned behind them. The brothers fell silent, the image settling where argument could not. Nomsa did not tell them what to do. She asked what they feared losing. Slowly, words changed shape. By evening, the brothers had not reconciled, but they had stopped accusing. They agreed to pause, to consult elders rather than escalate alone. The village exhaled, tension easing though not vanishing. Nomsa stayed the night, knowing that change must be witnessed to hold. During that same time, Thabo reached a crossroads both literal and inward. Offered a chance to return to his home region for modest work, he hesitated, pride wrestling with necessity. He remembered Nomsa's steadiness, the way she never ran from consequence. He accepted the work, uncertain but willing. Returning felt heavier than leaving had ever been. Familiar roads greeted him without warmth, and faces that once smiled now watched cautiously. Thabo did not protest their distance. He understood that trust, once cracked, does not rush to repair itself. Nomsa returned to her town after several days, tired but grounded. She was welcomed without fanfare, which pleased her more than ceremony ever could. The children ran to her, eager to share new lessons learned. She smiled, seeing continuity rather than dependence. Soon after, word arrived that Thabo had returned nearby, working quietly and keeping to himself. Nomsa received the news without reaction, neither relief nor anger stirring. Some chapters, she knew, do not require revisiting to remain closed. Distance can be a form of peace. Thabo, however, carried questions that would not settle. One afternoon, he walked to the edge of Nomsa's town, but did not enter. He stood beneath a tree, watching children laugh and elders speak freely. He saw Nomsa among them, present without dominance. The sight humbled him more than confrontation ever could. He turned away without announcing himself, understanding that some apologies are meant to be lived rather than spoken. He returned to his work with quieter hands and fewer expectations. The man he was becoming was still unfamiliar, but it was no longer empty. Nomsa sensed the shift without knowing its details. She felt it in the way her nights rested more deeply, in how memories arrived without sharpness. The ancestors, she believed, had accepted the balance being restored. The work now was to sustain it. As the year moved forward, Nomsa began training others in mediation and teaching, encouraging shared responsibility. She spoke openly about her past, not to center it, but to show how mistakes can become tools. Vulnerability, she taught, is not weakness when guided by wisdom. The town listened. On a quiet evening, Nomsa sat alone beneath the fig tree, watching shadows lengthen. She reflected on how far she had come without traveling far at all. Justice had not lifted her above others. It had returned her to herself, and that, she understood, was its deepest form. The winds shifted as they often do before great change, subtle enough to be ignored by those not paying attention. Nomsa felt it in the way mornings arrived cooler and evenings lingered longer, as though time itself was reconsidering its pace. She sensed that the work she had begun was entering a new stage, one that would test not her strength but her trust in others. Letting go, she knew, was the final lesson of leadership. A gathering of elders from surrounding villages was called, prompted by shared concerns that cross borders and histories, disputes over water, grazing paths, and old agreements threatened to fracture alliances that had endured generations. Nomsa was invited not as a judge but as a witness, a role she accepted carefully. Witnessing, she believed, carried responsibility without authority. The elders met beneath an open sky, sitting in a wide circle that left no one at the center. Each spoke in turn, voices weighted with memory and caution. Some carried anger sharpened by years of being unheard. Others spoke from fear of losing what little remained. Nomsa listened, recognizing patterns she had seen many times before. When silence finally came, it did not feel empty but expectant. Nomsa spoke briefly, reminding them that the land and water they argued over had outlived all their quarrels. She asked them to imagine what stories their grandchildren would inherit if this moment defined them. The question lingered longer than any argument. The elders did not resolve everything that day, but they agreed to continue together rather than apart. They established shared stewardship rather than exclusive claim. An imperfect solution shaped by necessity. Nomsa watched as decisions emerged not from victory, but from fatigue with conflict. Sometimes peace begins where pride grows tired. Thabo, working nearby, heard fragments of the gathering through passing conversation. He listened more than he spoke, careful not to insert himself into spaces he had once dominated. His labor was modest, his pay small. Yet he felt a steadiness unfamiliar to him, for the first time. His worth was not measured by what he controlled. One evening, Thabo was asked to help repair a communal well damaged by neglect. He worked alongside men who knew his past but chose not to rehearse it. Sweat and shared effort softened the edges between them. Thabo realized that redemption, when it comes, often arrives disguised as ordinary work. Nomsa noticed the well repair from a distance, recognizing Thabo without surprise. She did not approach, trusting the space between them to hold what needed holding. Some connections, she believed, must be reshaped by time rather than words. The absence of confrontation felt like a mercy extended to them both. Zinhal returned again, this time staying longer, curious about the life her mother had built. She observed Nomsa in conversation, in teaching, in quiet moments of rest. What struck her most was not her mother's influence, but her ease, strength. Zinhal saw could coexist with gentleness. Together they spoke of choices, of love unburdened by obligation, of futures not shaped by fear. Nomsa did not advise. She asked questions and listened. She wanted her daughter to walk freely, not carefully. The legacy she offered was not protection, but perspective. As months passed, Nomsa deliberately stepped further back, encouraging others to lead discussions and resolve conflicts. She intervened only when asked, and even then sparingly. The community adjusted, discovering its own capacity. Dependence faded, replaced by shared confidence. Thabo's work contract ended, and he was offered a chance to stay on permanently. He accepted with gratitude, understanding the value of consistency. He no longer chased recognition, content to contribute quietly, in moments of solitude. He reflected on how easily he had once mistaken possession for purpose. One afternoon, Nomsa and Thabo crossed paths briefly at the market. Their exchange was simple, respectful, and without weight. They greeted each other as people who had traveled far through the same storm and survived. Differently, when they parted, neither looked back. The Elders' Council met again later in the season, reporting fewer disputes and quicker resolutions. Nomsa attended, as an observer, proud without attachment. She saw faces she had once calmed, now calming others. The work had multiplied beyond her hands. At night, Nomsa dreamed less of the past and more of open landscapes, paths without obstacles. She woke rested, grateful. The ancestors, she felt, had loosened their grip. Satisfied with the balance restored, their silence now was blessing, not absence. As the year leaned toward its close, Nomsa prepared to mark the season with a simple ceremony of thanks. It was not a celebration of victory, but of continuity. She invited no speeches, only presence. Sometimes survival itself is the achievement. Standing beneath the fig tree as the gathering dispersed, Nomsa felt a deep, quiet certainty. Her story was no longer about betrayal or justice alone, but about transformation shared. The quiet woman had not only spoken, she had listened, learned, and released, and in doing so, she had allowed the community to find its own voice. The final season arrived without announcement, settling gently like ash after a long fire. The fig tree stood fuller than ever, its roots deepened by years of careful tending and shared labor. Nomsa walked its shade one morning, tracing the grooves in its bark, aware that cycles do not end so much as widen. What had begun as personal reckoning had become communal memory. The town no longer looked to Nomsa instinctively, and this pleased her. Voices rose from many directions now, confident and measured, shaped by experience rather than instruction. Conflicts still appeared, as they always would, but they were noted early and met together. The ground felt steadier beneath everyone's feet. An elder approached Nomsa that afternoon, speaking of a younger generation ready to learn the old ways of listening and judgment. He asked if she would share her story, not as confession, but as teaching. Nomsa agreed, knowing that stories lose power when hoarded. Wisdom, like seed, must be scattered. That evening, people gathered beneath the open sky, children leaning into parents, elders sitting with hands folded. Nomsa stood among them, not before them, and waited until the murmurs faded. She spoke slowly, telling of choices made in silence, of strength hidden beneath patience, of justice that arrives wearing many faces. She did not name villains or elevate herself. She spoke of mistakes as teachers, and of anger as a fire that must be used carefully. She described how greed narrows vision, and how fear can disguise itself as control. Her words moved not to impress, but to illuminate. The crowd listened not because they were instructed, but because they recognized truth. When Nomsa finished, there was no applause, only a thoughtful quiet. People nodded, some smiled, others looked inward. The elder thanked her and said nothing more. The story had landed where it needed to. Far off, Thabo heard echoes of that gathering through travelers passing by. He paused in his work, listening to familiar patterns reshaped by time. He felt no urge to correct or claim any part of it. The story was no longer his to shape, and he accepted that with humility. Acceptance, he had learned, was not erasure but release. Zinhal prepared to leave again, her path pulling her toward wider horizons. Before she went, she and Nomsa walked together at dawn, speaking of the future with ease. There were no warnings, only trust. Nomsa watched her daughter depart without fear, knowing that freedom carried forces stronger than protection. The seasons turned once more, and Nomsa aged gently into her role as keeper of memory rather than mover of events. She tended the fig tree, welcomed visitors, and stepped aside when not needed. Her life did not grow smaller with age, it grew deeper. Depth, she discovered, was a form of abundance. One night, as stars sharpened in the sky, Nomsa dreamed of her father, standing beneath the umsinsi tree of her past. He did not speak, but his presence was warm and approving. When she woke, there was no sadness, only peace. The ancestors, she knew, walk beside those who walk honestly. In time, the story of the quiet woman became part of the region's oral fabric, told differently by each teller, yet holding the same spine. Some emphasized her foresight, others her restraint, others the downfall of those who underestimated her. What endured was the lesson that power rooted in integrity outlasts power built on appetite. Children learned this early, shaped by repetition and example. Nomsa herself faded from prominence, just as she wished. She lived fully, laughed often, and rested when tired. Her life did not seek monuments, it sought continuity. And so, people of the circle, this story is not finished, because it now belongs to you. Listen to the quiet voices around you, including your own. Question what you reach for and why you reach for it. When injustice appears, meet it with clarity rather than noise, with patience rather than haste. Carry this tale into your homes, your meetings, your disagreements, and your hopes. Tell it to those who believe power must shout to be real. Teach it to those who confuse possession with worth. Let it remind you that justice is strongest when shared, and resilience grows when rooted in community. If this story stirred something in you, do not let it rest only in memory. Speak differently, listen more deeply, act with foresight, and choose balance over conquest. Share this tale so that others may learn, and live it so that it becomes truth. The fire is warm, the night is long, and the story continues with you.